Alright then, hi guys, this is the Deafness article for Grinder School, and today I've got a video for you which is just going to be a review of a 15-hour session I played not too long ago. It's for tabling. I did have plans to make this a review of a session I played almost a year ago now, because I think there'll be substantially more mistakes in that, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether you'd like me to point out more of my mistakes or fewer of my mistakes in the video. I've got about. I think I've got about an hour of footage. Not sure how many videos that'll make, but yeah. I think this should be hopefully informative and a nice change of pace from my normal live play affair. Whoops. I must have accidentally recorded sound on this. So, as per, I'm going to be trying not to comment on standard stuff, but something I am going to quickly note is that because I think people defend their blinds in a less correct manner at 50NL relative to 100NL, or at least to rephrase that, fewer regs are defending their blinds adequately, I'm going to be reverting to the min raise on the button, because I expect to have significantly more fold equity with that size than I would at 100. And also I think I'm going to be using pretty much somewhat wider c-bet ranges than I otherwise would, because I expect people to overfold. I think we're going to fold King Queen Suited on the flop here. It's pretty close, to be honest. Just because the argument in favour of folding is that he c-bet four way, and that has two related consequences for in terms of the range with which we should continue. Firstly, it indicates that his range is somewhat stronger, and secondly, it means that in terms of preventing him from auto-profiting, or at least in terms of making him indifferent between betting and checking with the weakest part of his bluffing range, it means that the responsibility for reaching whatever defense frequency is required for that is going to be shared between three people, whereas this will be a very easy call on the flop heads up. The argument in favour of calling here is essentially going to be that we have some backdoor potential, and also the fact that our calling range should be pretty tight on this flop means that we can expect A to rarely get barreled because our range is strong, but also B to have significant fold equity when we do get checks to on turns and rivers. And as it happens, I elected to call, but I think either option is probably fine. And obviously when we do turn a flush draw, all of a sudden we can't fold whatsoever. I'm actually remembering playing this hand now, and I do something interesting on this river. I decided to jam. Well, there are two real reasons for this. Firstly, his sizing is fairly small relative to the pot, and that's indicative, I think, of a hand which is very often ace king or ace queen. The fact that we have blockers to those hands doesn't really affect anything, or once in a blue moon a bluff. But realistically, I don't expect people to be tripling his board to bluff, especially given we hold both the king and queen of hearts. I think ace four will probably bet larger on the river. And also I think a lot of combos of it won't bet the flop. Some regs also won't open it pre, but I think that's closer. And I also don't think he has any 4x here, apart from ace 4, because 5-4 suited is a very loose open under the gun, and obviously king 4 suited is pretty much trash. Whereas if you consider our range, we have lots of combos of 4x. because we're on the button, we can pretty much peel the flop with not peel pre with not only ace four, but given the odds we were getting pre, we also have king four, 5-4, 4-3 suited, probably 6-4 suited. We could also end up peeling. We also end up peeling the flop with ace six, which we don't expect our opponents to have, both because it's a non-standard opener under the gun, and also if you do reach this flop with a6, it's going to be a check on the flop most of the time. And also we could have floated the flop with well, obviously 6-5 of hearts and 6-5 of diamonds we can't hold because they're blocked by the board, but we can get here with 6-5 of clubs, which is one more combo. And I think in addition to that, it's actually very tough for us to show up with bluffs here. If you remember our discussion of the flop play, you'll remember that this, which is pretty much the best non-ace hand to peel on this flop, or rather non-ace or better. This is pretty much the best non-ace or better hand to peel on this flop. It was actually a pretty close decision between calling and folding, which means that we have three combos of king queen suited. Well, actually, we'll probably fold most of those on the turn, and for that reason, this is probably close to our only bluff, because we might also peel some three to a straight combos, three to a straight, three to a flush combos on the flop at the bottom end. But the only real, unless we have 3-2 suited pre, which I don't think our opponent will think we do, I'm not sure whether I peel it pre either. It's pretty close. This ends up being our only bluff combo in this spot, without turning ace-x into a bluff. And realistically, I don't think we're going to be perceived to turn ace-x into a bluff, even if it might be a pretty decent idea to start turning like ace-10 into a bluff here, just because we definitely have value combos, and we expect our opponent's range to be relatively weak, but also and thus to be nearly always folding to a jam. I should say, with regards to whether he nearly always folds to a jam, if he starts bet calling ace king here, then it's very bad for us to be bluffing, just because we expect ace king to make up a huge portion of his betting range there, and we don't expect people to be thinking on a sophisticated enough level to try and make his indifference bluffing, which would probably involve calling some combos of ace king and folding others. So if he does call ace king, he's going to be calling too often for us to be bluffing that spot. This is given our assumptions that his range is that his range contains basically no bluffs, which I think is quite accurate for the reasons discussed earlier. With ace-8 on the top right, I considered leading the turn, and I think in general, as part of a general strategy, it's good to lead turn cards which pair the second card on the board. I have discussed this in prior videos, but I'll quickly run through the reasoning again. This is because the c-better is very rarely going to c-bet a second pair. This means that when the second card pairs, and I should add that pretty clearly the caller is never going to do anything else but check call with second pair. So when the second board card pairs, this all of a sudden creates a lot of trips combos in the caller's range, which should give them a pretty substantial range advantage in lots of situations. The reason, which in itself is a solid reason to lead the turn, it means that all of a sudden their expectation with the range increases relative to the pots, and leading the turn because their range is stronger is the best way to realise that expectation. Now, the reason why I elect not to lead here is because despite it not having a flush draw on it, which makes it slightly less a case, but this is a board on which I would be expected to raise a lot of strong hands on the flop. So for instance, pocket sixes and pocket nines, well, probably not pocket nines, but pocket sixes and 10-8 suited, both of which I'll have pre. I'll probably be raising on the flop. Same with most 2-pair combos. And also, I don't actually have a whole ton of 7x pre, which adds value to our opponent's overpairs relative to our range here. With that said, however, I think this is a pretty close spot because the board is not soaking, so it's not like there's a significant portion of our opponent's range which beats our entire range. Especially given we're probably check calling pocket nines on this board, and also we do have some amount of 7x pre. We probably have a7 suited, 9-7 suited, 8-7 suited, 7-6 suited, possibly 7-5 suited and king 7 suited. So like I said, it's not clear cut by any stretch of the imagination. If I don't make any of the general adjustments that I discussed earlier at any point in this video, it's probably because I was also piloting and thus reverted to my standard. Facing a bet on this turn, I think it's quite interesting with ace-8 specifically. I think ace-8 is a call and king-8 is probably a fold, because with ace-8 you actually beat a substantial amount of your opponent's bluffing range without improving, which increases the EV of a course of what it is, especially considering we don't expect our opponent to be tripling hands like king queen and king jack anything close to 100% of the time. I think as a general game plan in this video, in order to make it somewhat more interesting, I decided, and also because I think this is going to be a pretty decent, close to optimum approach at 50 zoom. My general game plan was mostly based around attacking weak ranges consistently. I think 9-8 offsuit is a very marginal c-bet here, but our opponent seems to be overfolding to c-bets over a small sample, and also we expect the population to overfold as well. I think calling a turn with 8-6 here against the pot size bets is probably bad, just because I think we expect pot size bets to be weighted towards value, and 8-6 also is very vulnerable to pretty much all his bluffs. So for instance, Jack 3 here even has, well, 3 jacks and 4 tens again, which beats his on the river, so 7 outs, and that's Jack 3. And also, when people are bluffing using pot-sized bets, we expect them to follow through on the river substantial amounts of the time. And that's not good when we have a very weak bluff catcher. Something I hope you've been picking up from watching my videos is that you actually need to defend your big blind substantially wider than a lot of the theory that you've probably been privy to, just because this was something that was only really discovered or only really started happening to a proper extent in probably late 2013, early 2014, and while I still maintain that older poker books are rarely very good, that still does leave a few years of books worth reading in there. So you've probably read or seen a lot of books and videos which essentially advocate a very high folding percentage in the big blind against all positions, pretty much based on the rationale that it's tough to play out of position, so we don't want to play weak hands, and this includes hands which especially offsuit hands, which you're going to struggle when you flop top pair, is the reasoning essentially. Now I think this is true. You are often going to struggle when you take a hand like Queen 10 to the flop. Heads up out of position, or indeed a hand like Queen 5 offsuit. The thing is, when you face it, for instance, when you face a min raise, a button min raise, and you're in a big blind, all that we need to establish in order to make a hand a call is that calling is going to be more profitable than folding. Now, when we fold, our EV for the hand is, well, clearly -1 big blind. That's our EV for the hand. Our immediate EV is 0. When we call for 1 big blind more, as a result, all we have to do is show that we recover, on average, at least that 1 big blind from the pot. So let's say we are facing min raise. Let's just use a rakeless game because it's easier. The math becomes easier. All we need to show in that instance is that on average we recover 1 big blind from a 4.5 big blind pot. That's clearly 2 big blinds from 2 players and half a big blind from the small blind, which is less than 25% of the pot. Now, clearly against the button range, you're going to get that pretty much with any 2 cards. The reason why we don't simply just call it any 2 cards is because hot and cold equity is something of a flawed methodology in terms of in terms of approaching whether we should call it in a particular spot. The reason being that I'm just going to pause the video here because I think I possibly want to talk about this Queen 5 hand. The reason being that you're very rarely going to realise 100% of your hot and cold equity. That's the equity that you see when you put in your hand against your opponent's range on PokerStove or whatever. The thing is, or rather, I think it was Sean LaForte about probably late 2012 now, popularised this idea of a concept called R, and R was a percentage of the equity that you realised. No, there's no strictly mathematical way to calculate your R in any given situation. That was simply not feasible. Except possibly you can make a better educated guess through meticulous database analysis. But in general, the R of any given hand, you just have to go on a gut feeling basically. Now, general ideas as to what R is for calling a big blind against the button min raising range do vary somewhat, but conventionally for the range that you call with, it's thought that R is going to be between 60% and 80%, less than 100% because you're out of position and your range is capped pre-flop. Now, let's take a middle value from that. Let's say your R is 60%. You're not quite reaching this. I think it's probably this 4.5. This taking back 1 out of 3 out of 4.5 big blinds. I think you're looking at something like 22% here. You're not quite reaching that when you multiply your hot and cold equity against the range by 0.65 or something with some hands, but you are still reaching that with a wide range of hands. Actually, that's not strictly true because we can't simply apply this flat R value to every single hand, and I think it's probably true to say that R is actually going to be substantially less than 60% for some of the weakest hands. So for instance, 3-2 off, you're just going to have to check fold nearly every flop. So R is probably going to be something in the 40, maybe even lower region. So you are going to have this low R. You're not going to be able to realize anything like the percentage of the pot that your hot and cold equity would dictate. But with better hands, your R is going to be somewhat higher. You're going to realize a better percentage of the pot, either because you have high card value, because you've got playability with suitedness and connectedness, or for whatever reason, your R is higher for your entire range. Factors which can make your R higher for your entire range are particularly strong hands being included in your range. So, for instance, if you flattered aces in that particular spot, then the R of your range would increase substantially. The problem is, while this is going to increase the EV of your flatting range somewhat, you're going to lose a ton of EV by not 3-betting aces in that spot. Now, and another factor which increases the R of your range as a whole is going to be, well, either position and / or having a skill edge on your opponents. Basically, any of the sources of edge you can have. So, I think it clearly follows from this that possibly against some players against whom we have a particularly significant post-flop edge, we should be calling 100% pre-flop in the big blind against the button min raise. And I think in a rakeless game, you should probably do that against anyone against whom a table would probably form around at regular tables. Now, I realise I've waffled on for a bit about this defending sufficiently often in a big blind thing, so I'm going to just quickly talk about this Queen 5 suited hand. We make a pretty standard call pre against a small blind open. I mean, if it's not clear to you that should be a call, then think about what we've just been discussing in terms of R, and add to that the fact that we're now in position. And then we make a pretty standard flow. So on the flop, we have a backdoor flush draw, some backdoor straight draws, and queen high is going to be good, some small potential of the time, although realistically, we're probably not going to get to showdown with it unimproved either, because we're going to be barreled off our hand, or we're going to turn this into a bluff on eternal river. So I think that's somewhat less relevant. It's more relevant that queen high with backdoor straight and flush draws is actually pretty high in our range here on this flop, especially given it's a paired flop. Actually, I'm sorry. I've just been talking about a hand which didn't happen. I think I'm going to go back a few seconds, but I think our opponent checks the flop to us. We will see in a moment. And if our opponent did check the flop to us, and that changes things. Not too much for the analysis of the rest of the hand, but the reasons why we show up with queen 5 here change a little bit. There are a lot of turn cards we can barrel. This little 78 number here, that means that our opponent is folding a lot, well 78% to a bet after missing a c-bet out of position. So that means that we should be betting a very wide range. The hand has no showdown value, well, very little showdown value, especially against its checking range, because we can expect him to c-bet a lot of worse hands than ours in terms of winning unimproved. We turn more equity, the turn seems like a pretty standard barrel for that reason, and we still have no showdown value, and we river a flush. So, yeah, clearly going to value bet that river. So, I'm not sure if you could see that in the bottom left with 10-9 suited, but we end up facing a pot size c-bet after calling a 3-bet pre, and while 10-9 suited is going to be defending a sufficiently large portion of our range against that sizing, when a weaker player does bet pots after 3-betting, we tend to just assign him a very strong range. so that makes it correct to exploitatively overfold there. We're probably just going to see about 100% on this queen, queen, queen flop, just because it's a board which absolutely smashes our range, because we have all the strong pairs and our opponent doesn't. And our opponent's range has a lot of hands which aren't going to be able to put up with lots of pressure. So we're leading this this 4 turns. The reasons discussed in the ace-8 hand earlier. Except now we're leading a turn card which pairs a third card on the board. The rationale is essentially the same. The two things which make leading a paired third card on the board slightly less inviting than leading a paired second card are that firstly we can be expected to have fewer of the paired third card in our range just because naturally it's a lower card. We play higher cards rather than lower cards in general. But also our opponent is somewhat more likely to see bet third pair than they are second pair on the flop. Nevertheless, given that we've defended and button in the big blind against the button open, we do have plenty of pretty much every rank pre, so we're going to have plenty 4x. And given it's an ace-xx board, we expect our opponents to see bets third pair somewhat less often than they otherwise would. Ace-king on the bottom left here is going to be pretty close between betting and checking. I think we can definitely check call, especially with the king of spades, but that also makes betting more attractive. Ultimately, because I think people at 50NL are going to overfold somewhat against c-bets. I think c-betting is a bit more attractive, but I don't think it's absolutely clear cut. So I think check calling here is also going to be fine. We're barreling the turn with equity. The flop c-bet is because this is, as we said earlier, we are going to be c-betting this flop more often than we would at slightly higher stakes, just because we expect people to fold more often. Just because they're thinking less about reaching minimum defense frequencies, and we decided to check the river. We river in 8. It's not a great amount of showdown value, but if our opponents check call twice with like king queen or something, then we do win at showdown 7% of the time, and we don't want just to be blindly triple barreling everything. So hands which have some showdown value, even if it's a very small amount of showdown value, are going to make better candidates to choose not to bluff with on the river, just in terms of not bluffing far too often. And I guess that matters less at 50NL, but on that particular board texture, you're actually going to have to go back a few seconds if you don't remember what it is. What it was, well, it was ace, 10s, hens, 2-tone, 2 clubs, 7 which brought a second flush draw out there, and then an 8 which completed the first flush. We don't expect our opponents to be folding a whole lot there, and when our opponent does fold, it's likely a hand which was beaten by ours anyway, because they're obviously not folding a 10, probably not folding an ace. A lot of the hands they peel the flop with are going to be flush draws. So realistically, and a lot of the stuff that they are going to fold is going to be hands like king, queen of spades, which we beat anyway. No real point in betting ace king at any point there. We just call pre because our opponent's quite nitty. He's only opening 16% of the middle position, and because of his sport c bets, the flop seems like a very easy check call. At 50-0, this 763 is just going to be board in which we have an incredibly high c-bet percentage, just because the reason that our opponent's cut-off calling range pre isn't really going to contain a lot which hits our board hard, and we have two overcards with pretty much our entire range, which doesn't have a gut shot. There's only pretty much ace 2 suited, which doesn't have at least two overcards or a gut shot and an overcard, and three combos of that obviously have a backdoor flush draw as well. So we have a decent equity with our entire range. We also don't expect our opponents to call with pocket sixes or pocket threes pre, because, well, step mining is going out of fashion, and I've discussed why I don't think step mining in that spot is good, with particularly low pocket pairs in prior videos, so I won't bore you with going over it again. And we expect our opponent not really to be focusing too much on reaching minimum defense frequencies, so they might start folding lots of ace high, which isn't going to be good. I mean, on the other hand, you are going to get some opponents who just think, oh, I have two overcards, I float, without considering that they're going to have two overcards with their entire range. So you are going to get the two extremes here, I think. But I expect it to be more weighted towards overfolding. I think either 3-betting or calling king 10 suited here is fine against the fish. The reason I 3-bet, and I think 3-betting is slightly better, is just because I think initiative still means something good as a fish. They're the players who tend to fold far too much to c-bets now on a lot of boards, which is good for us, whereas they often just start spazzing when you donk bets, which means you can't take advantage of it after calling pre. Though it should be noted that I do think that initiative is a largely dead concept now. I think it's just a lazy way of expressing range advantage without considering that the person with the initiative in the traditional sense might not always have the range advantage. Again, going back to the ace-8 hand before, so for instance where the second board card pairs. But it is true that in general the person who last bets will have the stronger range at any given point. Everything that's going on at the moment seems pretty standard. Some would check this 10 on the river, because our opponent does have some 10s, but I don't think that's necessary, because the big blind calling range is wider than button opening range. We necessarily have more 10s. We also have some kings and some queens, and more queens in our opponent, I should say. But also, I don't think this particular 10 is quite strong enough to check raise the value. So I don't think it makes sense to check here. The one option here with king queen that I don't really like is calling. I think either folding or 4-betting is probably fine. I'm inclined to 4-bet just because there aren't many better hands in our range to 4-bet, considering we're calling ace queen off, and probably not ace jack off, but because some of its 3-bet bluffs are going to be ace x, I think kings and queens are better blockers than aces. And also we're going to be calling king queen suited, king jack suited, etc. I'm essentially checking this flop with king queen in order to have some hands which can, in my checking range, which can very comfortably call both turn and river. And also because I don't really expect to be able to get stacks in with a huge advantage by betting. Whereas if I check, we can induce some spares or some more legitimate bluffs. And this isn't the type of board in which he's likely to have a large reverse floating range. But it should be noted that after checking here, we're not planning to fold at any points. It's basically the top of our range, and folding the top of your range at any point without an extremely strong read is pretty much a no-no. Just because when you're deviating so substantially from the GTO play, I'm not a big fan of that. That particular usage of GTO. Let's say the balanced play. Because deviating wrongly, especially making such a substantial deviation as folding the top of your range at any point, that's a massive mistake. You lose a lot by doing that. Whereas making the correct deviation in spots where it's a particularly massive deviation, you're only going to gain a small amount. So you have to be absolutely certain to make such a deviation. I should note that the turn check with oh wait, I check. I check all the flop. Never mind. I think river sizing on the top right is somewhat interesting. I think about 2/3 pots is probably about right. We don't have a ton of bluffs because a lot of the hands that we peel the flop with, which a straight draw has got there. So obviously, queen 10 is a straight, 10-9 is trips. If we have 10-7 is a straight, 9-7 is trips. But we do still have hands like 7-6 and 6-5, as well as some king queen etc. type hands which can bluff. And we can probably bet jack x plus of value. So I don't think there's any need to either bet particularly small or particularly large. And also we don't really have any reads from which we can exploit this player. You'll notice that, especially in 3-bet and 4-bet pots, I am just tanking a bit even when I have a very obvious decision, just because it's not good to give away with your time the fact that you do have a very obvious decision, because that will allow your opponent to narrow your range more than they otherwise should. I mean, clearly if you just snap fold, that's fine, because your opponent can't exploit you after you've folded. They can exploit the fact that you have folded, but that's not affected by the timing you use. And I think that river jam with ace 10 is absolutely terrible for what it's worth. Well, I say that assuming it's a bluff. I'm not too in touch with how the population at 50NL plays in 4-bit pots, but if he's playing against a population which just always has like ace king or ace 2 here, and never anything stronger than a 10, then yes, obviously jamming is fine. But once members of the population are checking back the flop with, well, I think in 4-bet pots in particular, it's going to be more common to see the flop being checked back with aces or kings here, because you can get it in 2 streets. But also, king queen obviously might check back the flop. Jacks if it's 4-bet pre, which I think is a mistake, but some will do it. Is going to check back the flop some percentage of the time. Ace queen if it's 4-bet pre, which again I think is a mistake, is going to check back the flop, and also pocket queens. We're betting this flop with queen six. We have basically no equity, but when it's limited in the small blind and then they check a flop like this, I think it's very rare that they're going to have anything. So while queen high is actually going to be good a very decent amount of the time there, the fact that we're denying equity to our opponents' no pair hands, which nonetheless have 6 outs against us most of the time when we are ahead, that's a good thing. We're 3xing the button here because both blinds are fish. We'd probably be 3xing if the small blind was reg, just because the big blind is such a big fish. And he's folding a very large amount of c-bet, so we're just going to close our eyes and bet pretty much everything all the time. So in the top right, we call a 3-bet pre with ace-jack offsuit. So I think that's pretty marginal, but when it's a weaker player who's 3-betting, I think it's probably just about fine. Especially considering they made it slightly smaller than a usual size 3-bet. Then when we check on a flop, I think it's very clear value bets, because I think although I think weaker players are going to check aces through queens more often than regulars on that flop, I still think that it excludes them from our opponent's range a sufficient percentage of the time that it makes ace-jack a very clear value bet there. When we get min raised, I mean, I don't think we can fold, even if we're just drawing to aces and jacks. But also because I think, especially on a board with this texture, there's just going to be spasms in the time. We are going to be checking back blank turn, so, and obviously we hit, which is very nice, and we're delighted, and etc. When he checks a turn, I think that's either some spaz going for a wacky double check raise, or kings or queens a very decent percentage of the time. So spaz, we're obviously getting nothing if it's check folded, regardless of our bet size, and we're obviously getting everything if it's check jammed, regardless of our bet size. Though I do think that a smaller bet is more conducive to a check jam here, because if we bet like 17, then I think even a fish can see that we're getting very good odds with our entire range. We could jam, but I think that prevents our opponent from spazzing, and also makes it more likely that they're going to fold kings or queens. But also the advantage of betting small is that I think they're less likely to fold kings or queens on the turn to a smaller bet than a larger bet. And while it might seem absurd to expect a fish to fold kings or queens on his turn ever, well, I'm sure you've seen fish make some pretty weird folds in the past, even in live cash games. I mean, clearly you rarely see the cards of a fish online, but televised live cash games, the live cash games you've played in, etc. So ultimately, I think betting pretty small is going to be best here, because it's going to leave an amount on the river which are often just going to think null pot odds with and call when they do have kings and queens. So I think about 11, which leaves 23 into 40 on the river, I think is going to be a good size. 24 into 40, I should say. But I was lazy and just bet my 35% size. And against a donk bet, we're just going to raise pretty big to hope to get value. We're not delighted with the turn card, obviously, but... and he shows, top right shows him with ace king, which is a bit weird. We're not delighted with the turn card, obviously, but it seems a spot where we donked into again. I can't actually remember. And also, I'm just going to quickly point out, I don't think we can fold. We can raise with a jack on the bottom right against the pot size pairs. On a turn, it's a pretty close decision between raising and calling. The thing is, I think fish are actually going to be inclined when the flush completes to start folding a lot of 10x on the turn, and obviously weaker hands as well. So I think that makes raising less attractive, despite the small sizing meaning that we'd like to get a bit more money in the pot than we do by just calling. And also, but when he bets a river pretty small, I think that indicates a weaker range than and then the turn bet small. So I think raise folding small is going to be the best line, especially considering when they show up with a 10 or an 8 here. Considering our sizing, they're just going to see that they're getting 5-1 and just, again, lol pot odds call. But unfortunately, it shows up with a flush. Okay, I'm actually going to finish this first part here. And I'm actually going to finish my recording session here, so the video might start at slightly different points for the second part. But I'm sure you'll cope. It'll only be about 3 or 4 seconds difference if it does start at a different point. So, thanks guys. I've been Definite Article for Grind School, and good luck at the tables.